Oh. Okay, I also feel like some of these have been things that you guys have probably heard me discuss before, but they're just still questions that we most commonly get. So the first one is, should inspection requests be listed on an addendum or an amendment? Anyone? An amendment.
Amendment.
Anything post purchase agreement being accepted would be an amendment because you're amending the terms of the original contract. Anything that's negotiated prior to the signing of the purchase agreement as an addendum, or you can do it as in addition to the purchase agreement. Does the inspection contingency need to state that it's removing the inspection contingency? So if you're negotiating through the inspection, you're drafting an amendment, do you need to state on there that it removes it? The technical answer is no, because once the time frame for the inspection period has expired, your inspection time frame has expired, right? And that amendment is just an agreement to buyer and seller for what's going to be completed. Do I see a lot of agents request this? Yes. In all fairness, it's probably older agents, myself included, or older, because prior to the purchase agreement being changed, the verbiage wasn't as tight knit surrounding the inspection contingency. So that was frequently included. So all parties were aware that we were removing that contingency.
I think it makes sense if you're doing that negotiation a few days prior to your contingency timeline running out too. So they know that like, this is it, we're done.
So did you guys hear what Crystal said? Like if you're not at the end of the wire of your inspection time frame that you're negotiating, let's say you had a 10-day inspection period, but you're getting through it on day 3. Maybe you want to include that verbiage in there just so that the buyers don't within the next 7 days decide to come up with something else and add it in, right? So I think that that's a fair statement. And I would probably include it there if I had a lengthy inspection time frame and we were negotiating it far before that was up. Next question. Can or should a buyer enter a purchase agreement assuming that they will renegotiate the purchase price during inspection? So this agent says they get that a lot where the buyers think that the purchase price can be renegotiated. Sorry, I got to admit some people here. So basically the question is, should a buyer go into a contract at a higher purchase price knowing that their intent is to renegotiate the purchase price during the inspection timeframe? I would say the last few years, that's been difficult, right? With all the multiple offers, the seller's probably just going to tell you to kick rocks and then move on to the next buyer. So I don't think that that's a good strategy. I think you want to go in with your honest offer up front. Additionally, like I advise my buyers that the inspection timeframe isn't a time to start renegotiating pieces of the original contract. So we have another, I don't know if she's on here, another agent who during the inspection time frame, suddenly the buyer wanted to change the closing date. It's like, well, that's not what the inspection time frame is for. Now, would renegotiating a closing date make sense if there's a ton of repairs and the seller needs the additional time to complete the repairs? Sure. But to answer this question on if a buyer should enter a contract with the plan to renegotiate the purchase price during inspection, I would say no. Obviously, negotiate the purchase price during inspection if it's a result of repairs that came up on an inspection. But if you're going in at $275 just to win or with intents to then just try and lowball the seller later during the inspection period, I don't know that that's a tactic that I think is anyone's best interest. Another one, and we just were talking about this before we entered in that we started the Zoom, but if repairs and a price reduction are negotiating during the inspection contingency, should we put the price reduction on a separate amendment to sign? So the strategy or the thought process behind this is many agents will put the price reduction on one and any repairs that they're requesting on another to not have to send the repair request to the lender. Because once the lender starts seeing the repair request, based on underwriting, sometimes gets involved and wants to see proof of repairs, et cetera, et cetera. The real answer to this is everything should be going to the lender. Anything that's an amendment or an addendum should be going to the lender. If you don't, I'm going to use this term lightly, but it sounds scary. You could be considered part of mortgage fraud. The lender is supposed to have all of the documents to the purchase agreement. I know that this is a practice that's followed quite often. I know that sometimes lenders will even tell you to put them on separate ones and they don't want to see it, like, right, hear nothing, see nothing, know nothing. It happens all the time. Just because it happens doesn't mean it's right. So the answer to that is technically everything needs to be going to the lender, whether you separate them out on 2 separate forms or not. What kind of inspection items should be listed on line 192 of the purchase agreement? I don't have the purchase agreement that memorized. I'm guessing
It's
line
the
192 is the
section.
other section. So then
I'll check, I have it open.
the second part of this question is, if a buyer wants intrusive testing, are we required to list what the testing will be in the purchase agreement? The technical answer is no. You're just agreeing to intrusive testing. Would it be in everybody's best interest to just list it? Yeah, I think so. Especially on, I've seen this come up a lot, more and more common in the last couple of years. Sewer scope inspections have become popular, right? More and more buyers are doing them. Well, I'm seeing them more than I ever have. Some agents argue that those are intrusive. I say it depends on where the main entry is for that, right? Like in my own house, I have an older house. It's very accessible on the floor in my daughter's room. Would that be considered intrusive testing? They're taking a cap off to get into it. I would say no, they're not ruining any floors, walls, or anything like that. However, some of these are covered up with carpet, walls, other things. So in that realm, you could argue that it's intrusive testing. I think it's just best to disclose the test that you intend to do up front. Then there's no argument. There's no
like radon in there sometimes, because I've had someone argue me on radon and I'm like, this is so normal, stop it.
Yeah, weren't you the one where the agent was like, the seller was an environmental specialist and they didn't trust the radon testing?
That was me. I don't remember that.
Yeah, and I think it was that one. So you didn't have radon in there because technically that's not an intrusive test.
Right.
But Crystal had the seller, who was some kind of environmental specialist, said that the 24 or 48 hour tests are crap and they didn't trust them and didn't want to do a test. So that's where I feel like it's just in everybody's best interest to disclose all of the inspections that you intended.
We should just, if someone could make a note, it'd be nice if like you or Steve or someone came up with a clause and we could put that into our clauses on our MLS.
I might have one, like just stating that it covers
like the
any
normal testing, and then you can like add or remove based on what you're actually going to do.
Let me double check. I might have one already. Okay, next question. What do you do if the sellers can't move out on time during closing day and the new buyers can't have immediate occupancy? Should a form be executed prior to closing or at the closing table? So in this example, it's not something that was pre-negotiated, right? Like the purchase agreement said that closing was going to be given upon, or possession was going to be given upon closing, but maybe the movers were late, something happened. What should you do there? Well, you put it in the buyer's court, really, right? Hey, are you comfortable closing on this, knowing that they're not going to be out for a few hours? Or would you prefer to delay closing? I always recommend that we just delay closing. However, I know that that's not in everyone's best interest. Sometimes you have a domino effect of closings. So should a form be executed prior to closing or at the table? I mean, it depends on, that's a hard one. How did the transaction go? Do you trust the sellers? I mean, everything should always be put in writing, but what are you really going to be putting in writing at that point? Is it just a matter of like when the occupancy is going to take place? Is it a matter of them being responsible for any damage? I think that that's really a case-by-case situation, and this does happen frequently. I actually personally had a seller who wasn't even fully packed, and I was there in their house an hour before closing, throwing crap into boxes and loading it into a U-Haul truck. I think that if this happens to you, give me a call and let's talk through the scenario, what's exactly going on and how we can work with that.
I use it as a negotiation tool. I've gotten cleaning paid for, and then I would get a rent back signed and a security deposit so that in case they damage anything, because you can't technically do a walkthrough.
Right.
But if they take the fridge suddenly,
right.
like I typically will close get a rent back agreement, and then I'll try and negotiate something for them, like cleaning.
I think that's a great resolution, especially the cleaning. Like,
Yeah.
hey, well, you guys,
They're not gonna
you're
get it
not gonna
cleaned.
clean. You're
Yeah.
right. If you're already running behind on getting vacated, you're certainly not going to get it clean. So I think that's a great solution. I like it. Okay, this is one, and I've gotten it asked a ton lately. It's surrounding as is. And we did a training on it probably like 2 months ago. An as is sale isn't what everybody thinks it is, right? Like a lot of agents throw that term out there, but what their purpose of the as is sale is that the seller just really doesn't want to do any repairs, right? That's not technically an as is sale. An as is sale that includes the as is addendum actually eliminates any post closing what's the word, liability on the seller's behalf for the buyer to come after them later for. So one thing I want you guys to check for, and this is how you really probably know the listing agent doesn't know what they're doing, is if they have an as is addendum and a full seller's disclosure. It literally says on the seller's disclosure or on the as is addendum that you should not be using this addendum if a full disclosure was completed. It should just be a disclosure alternative, right? So a lot of times, and probably a lot of you on this call have called me on this recently, and I would always just challenge the agent in a professional way, like, hey, can you shed some light on why you're using this as is addendum? Most oftentimes you're going to get, the seller just doesn't want to make any repairs. Okay, well, that's not truly an as is sale. An as is sale is eliminating any post-closing liability on the seller's behalf, not a matter of negotiation on repairs, those types of things. Do you guys have any questions on that? Because I do get a lot of questions on this.
I feel like if you have that conversation with them though, and you're like teaching them this fact rather than just like basically saying, yeah, we're not going to sign that you're like giving them knowledge and leverage and more ammunition to like really want you to sign it and kind of force you into it. When in reality, like if they don't know what it means, I don't know.
Well, if you're representing the buyer, it's not in their best interest to sign an as is addendum, right? So that's why I'm saying challenge in a professional way, just calling the listing agent and say, hey, you have an as is addendum here. Why? What's the purpose of us using this? Again, you should not have a full seller's disclosure when using that either, because now they're disclosing things, but the as is addendum eliminates any post-closing liability or claims that the buyer can bring forth. So it's contradictory.
Right. When I see it, I check ownership, and if it's listed as an LLC or if the owner has a different address, then I assume it's like a rental property or a company. Then I explain it to my buyers as that being like super common and pretty reasonable. I would ask for that.
I think that makes sense. And that to further this, also get a lot of questions on the difference between seller's disclosure and a seller's, not a difference. I get questions on why would someone use a seller's disclosure alternative. A lot of agents on the team, and I don't know where this came from, but they heard from someone or somewhere that a seller's disclosure alternative cannot be used by an owner who's occupied the property, which is not true at all. The seller's disclosure alternative is actually designed for just that. Like you have an elderly seller who now has dementia and we're expecting them to disclose things. They've lived in the property. They just literally can't disclose. They don't remember things. The disclosure alternative is more in line for like investor who's rented the property out. They can't guarantee that the tenants didn't have a leaky toilet at one point and never told them. They just took care of it. You know, the landlord can't account for everything that's happened on that property when they've never occupied it. Same goes for individual who, like I said, has dementia or now has some kind of ailment that doesn't allow them to fill out the disclosure. An alternative shouldn't be used just for the sake of the fact that they don't want to disclose. It can be, but it really shouldn't be. So that's another thing where when we see the seller's disclosure alternative, if you have questions on why it's being used, call the listing agent and ask them. It'd be another thing that they just don't understand why that form should or shouldn't be used.
Can you ask them to do a full disclosure?
You can try, but like if you find out, hey, the seller has, you know, and the listing agent doesn't have to disclose why they're using the alternative, especially if the seller has dementia or I don't know if he cares that I call him out, but we have a transaction right now where the agent in our team is representing the buyer and the seller's in prison for murder.
Oh, wow.
So a disclosure alternative was created for that. And that's an interesting story, but there's just a lot of reasons why a disclosure alternative. And if you feel like you've been in the house and it seems like the homeowners actually live there, just call the listing agent and ask why the alternative.
I heard a rumor that as a real estate agent, we're not allowed to use the alternatives.
That's correct.
Okay.
So Crystal just asked, as licensed real estate agents, you do not, so that's another thing that I see happen often is investors who are licensed flip and do the alternatives. They're not supposed to. We as real estate agents cannot ever waive our right to disclose. So that brings up another valid point. If you're representing a seller who's filling out a seller's disclosure alternative, but you as the list agent know material facts about that property, it's still your obligation as a licensed real estate agent to disclose what you know about.
How do we do that?
In writing.
Just over an email?
I haven't had that happen
form.
yet. I think there might be a form in the MLS for agents to disclose what they need to know. Worst case, an email over to the listing agent, something that you could provide in a court of law that indicates that you are aware of that, right? Like, for example, I mean, I've seen things where a storm came through and a basement flooded during the transaction and the seller didn't want to disclose and the listing agent was like, what do I do? Well, you have a duty and an obligation to disclose that information. So you're going to have to disclose it even if your seller chooses not to.
Cass, this is Kelly. I think I already told you this, but I was always told, obviously this is not accurate, that you use a seller's alt if you have not occupied for 6 months or more. That's what I was always told, which is obviously not correct.
Yeah, it's not correct because, like, you know, maybe that was their rule of thumb.
Yeah, I don't think there's a hard rule.
There's no like hard rule. Okay, if you occupied this home 6 months or more, you can't use an alternative. Well, again, what if the seller has dementia?
Right.
What if the seller's like incapacitated in the vegetable in the hospital? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that was a term that,
or a murderer,
used, but or a murderer, right? You know, like there's just all of these. It's just such a case by case situation. I do think that they're used improperly quite frequently. But the hardstead thing that I've been hearing amongst agents on this team most often is, I heard that, you know, if they've ever occupied the property, they couldn't use an alternative. And the answer to that is that's incorrect.
Right. I don't see a document that says anything like agent disclosure. I guess if it was me, I'd probably use the amendment to disclosure. Yeah. It's just a big open section. Yeah. And I would write that it was from the agent. But I would assume that we also have to tell our client that we know that this is happening and we have to disclose it. Yep. Well, so, yeah, because you don't want them to then be upset that you didn't inform them that you were disclosing it. If we have to tell them, then wouldn't they get in trouble for not disclosing it? Well, again, if it's a seller disclosure or alternative. Also, another thing I want to note on the disclosure alternative is, even if they're using a disclosure alternative, the seller still cannot waive the other section regarding well, septic, environmental hazards. That still has to be completed. Okay. All right. Any questions from any of that?
Do they have to disclose if there's a murder on the property in that alternative?
So no, on the alternative, you don't have to disclose anything. So this is,
it's not prompted.
This is the issue where we're dealing with this agent right now, and we represent the buyers. Yeah, I mean, if you guys don't know, the seller actually killed his dad and sister in this property. That's what he's
and then hired someone to sell it instead of just like letting it go. Like,
it's a much longer story than that, but anyhow, does that need to be disclosed in the technical terms in Minnesota? No, it doesn't. However, we have a lot of religions who don't believe in like occupying a home where the death occurred. Is it arguably in your best interest to disclose that information? I say yes. Do you guys ever hear the term, you have two hands, cover your ass with both? Like, you know, I mean,
I love it.
I always just say, like, wouldn't you hate to get under contract with a buyer who has a religious belief surrounding this? And then later on, they find out from the neighbor during the inspection, or In this case, I can't remember, it was Googled. Me and the agent went down a whole pigeonhole of reading the reports on this whole incident. That's a story for another day, but you know, it's just, why not just disclose up front instead of having that issue down the line where a transaction could fall apart? That's my thought process and theory on it, whether it's murder.
I think murder has to be disclosed.
Is
This is
it
Jelena,
murder?
sorry,
I thought you had to disclose.
I'm pretty sure murder has to be disclosed, but but not suicide.
Correct.
Murder doesn't need to be disclosed,
Okay.
not suicide.
Right.
And or
But
natural,
But
yeah.
there's no, okay, my understanding is if there isn't a prompted response on the alternatives, then you don't have to say it. So murder is not prompted. I feel like if it was a statute or a law that you had to disclose murder no matter what, even if you're using
If you look,
it would be
if you look it up
question.
online, Crystal, look up Minnesota statutes online, and it says it right under the Attorney General's office that it is a required disclosure item.
But does it?
But then she's
discuss
arguing with the
alternatives?
alternatives. And that, you guys, I'm just gonna be honest with you. I don't 100% know the answer to that. And I always get mixed
I think
up,
it's a
and
gray
Jelena, you're
area.
right. I get mixed up between the murder and suicide thing and which one should be disclosed. So I stand corrected with murder, and suicide does not. have to
Yeah,
be.
suicide.
So
doesn't.
flip what I was just saying.
That part.
If a suicide happens in the property, do you need to disclose it? And the answer is no. Would I still do it and encourage the seller to? Yes, I know that that's really hard because some of that's really emotionally driven. But again, when you have certain groups of people and religions who don't believe in owning a property that a death occurred, you could risk that transaction falling apart later. So thank you for correcting me on that, Jelena.
I just want to add this one thing, because I've actually come across this a couple times. There is nothing on the disclosure that states, like, there's no spot, Crystal's right, where that disclosure would be made. My understanding is it has to be disclosed by the agent to the other agent so they can inform their clients. So the only place I've ever seen it disclosed is under agent remarks on the MLS.
So, I mean, that brings us back to the point that Crystal was saying earlier, like maybe just completing a disclosure addendum as well. You know, if anybody here runs into that, give me a call. We can talk through it.
Hopefully that's rare.
Yeah, hopefully it's rare, right? I mean, actually,
They're saying
probably like the
this is
third or fourth
not.
murder situation.
It's a sub of this. It's saying it's not.
Okay.
So suicide.
Any other questions on that, you guys?
So you don't have to disclose if the house is spooky. That's
No.
funny.
All right. I'm gonna continue going down the.
She's just getting louder.
They are
and
so
louder.
loud.
Thank you, Jelena, for stepping in on that when I misspoke. And now I can't find my page. Hold on one second.
I actually have the statute open right now. One of them, I mean, this is kind of long. Maybe we should just put this out somewhere. They should read through. This
Okay.
is talking about disclosure. Because it says a licensee is not required to disclose except as otherwise. Oh wait, where did it go? Something
Well,
about
let
the
me-
physical condition. So I think it has to be a written report that discloses this physical item in order for us to be required to disclose it.
That there needs to be a report.
Mhm.
That's interesting. Well, let's circle back to that. Let's keep going through these. Next question was, should we print out a copy of the MLS listing and include it with the purchase agreement to sign and be initialed by buyers? I don't think that that's necessary. And the reason for that is nothing in the MLS is guaranteed except the buyer agent payout.
But I've had
Okay.
people change it after you go under contract
If they change it, you can contact the MLS
and they can look
and
it up.
they can look it up and see when it was changed. So the only thing guaranteed in the MLS, so I mean, you could print that out and have them initial. I don't know what purpose it serves. Could it maybe save you in an instant? I mean, really, the MLS isn't binding. So it's whatever is in your purchase agreement that's signed between buyer and seller. So even if a purchase agreement, or I'm sorry, even if the MLS indicated, you know, fridge, washer, dryer, et cetera, was included, but the purchase agreement didn't have those things and the seller took them, the MLS isn't going to grant you you know, the requirement of the seller to return those items. Does that make sense? So nothing in the MLS is guaranteed, square footage, any of that stuff. So I don't know that it's necessary for that to be printed out and signed. And to Crystal's point, commission has sometimes been changed after you get under a contract. And if that were to happen, you can contact the MLS. They can see exactly what day the MLS was changed. They can see all the back end data on how anything was changed.
That MLS sheet just for that reason.
What was that?
Sorry. I was just saying, I've had the same thing happen that Crystal's had happen. And that's why I do put just the front page that says whatever the commission disclosure is, because I have a printout of it. I don't make my clients initial it, but I do include it with the purchase agreement. So I have it as part of my solid, like my full record for the sale.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. And that's actually something I used to always do as well until I found out the MLS changed it. Is your way probably a little faster because then you just have the MLS printout and you could go back to the agent and say, what the heck are you doing? Why did you change this? But I just know that the MLS has the ability to go back in and say, hey, on this day at this time, this is what was changed.
I don't do it. Include it.
And yeah, I mean, I don't think it's wrong to include it. It just doesn't necessarily need to be initialed and part of your offer package. Which that goes to another question I think that you had in here, Jelena. Jelena came up with the majority of these questions, and I know Jelena knows the answer to the majority of these questions, but like Jelena gets questions about a lot of these things pretty consistently, so that's why we put this together. But one of the other questions is...
Pause a second.
Yeah, we have a lot of background noise here, so Liz is trying to ask everyone to be a little quieter. I'm trying to get to your other question, Delana. Okay, if the seller advertises that a repair or installation of something will be completed prior to closing, but it's not put in the purchase agreement, is it enforceable? The answer to that is no. Here is a personal example of it. I had a property listed several years ago that stated seller was willing to replace the carpet with an acceptable offer. Well, acceptable offer is subjective, right? We got an offer. It wasn't full price. We negotiated through it. This buyer's agent never included the replacement of the carpet in that offer. The agent calls me at walkthrough and says, you didn't replace the carpet. And I said, you didn't export. And he said, but it's in the MLS. And I said, but the MLS isn't binding. His buyers didn't get new carpet. I assume that the buyer's agent probably contributed to that. My sellers, bless their heart, ended up bringing a $500 Home Depot gift card for the buyers to replace the carpet, which also is not allowed. It happened. We just all pretended not to see that happening. But so the answer is no, just because it's listed in the MLS, if it is not in the contract and signed between buyers and sellers, it's not enforceable.
That's why when they put in like a warranty, I always write it into the warranty section.
Yeah, 100%. If they have a warranty, carpet replacement, anything that they're offering, even if it says with acceptable offer as the buyer's agent, I'm not just going to submit my offer and hope it's acceptable. I'm going to submit my offer with all of those additional terms, and the seller can counter back.
If you are the listing agent and you're offering a home warranty, do all of the buyer's agents a favor out there and put down the company and probably the price so they can just fill out that section easily. Because otherwise, I just did it and I didn't know what to write. So
but if you're the buyer's agent and they don't have that specific information, my viewpoint is then I can put whatever it is and what the amount is. Sure. But to your point, I've also seen some sellers buy the warranties because some warranty companies will cover that property during the listing period and then a year post. So you do need that information. But again, if you just put your own information in there, Crystal, and they don't counter back on that, their fault.
Right.
Can I bring up one little thing too? I had the situation come up where there were repairs that were written into the purchase agreement that the seller wanted to, said they would make, but it was not defined who was responsible for the installation. So they said that like windows would be replaced, but it was not defined in who was responsible for having the windows installed versus just delivered. So my advice is just be, if you come across a listing like that and you're negotiating on that type of property, be very specific in how those kind of repairs are going to be handled, because ultimately it will come down to what's in writing.
100% agree. Remember what I just said? 2 hands. Agreed. Like, I know, like I've had agents, not necessarily on this team, but elsewhere get annoyed with me when they'll have me like review an amendment. And I'm like, no, get more specific, like get more specific. Angie actually just had one. We represented the seller and the buyers were being a little bit ridiculous on what they were requesting, in our opinion. Nonetheless, I will give the agent credit for the fact that they had the most like detailed amendment. Like it was like either this company or this company is going to do a sewer scope inspection. If any items are found, the seller will have this company do all repairs as indicated by this company. Like it was outlined, like there was, like, I just feel like even though they were being ridiculous in what they were asking, the amendment was so clearly written that there was no question who was responsible for what in those scenarios. And so that's what I always kind of, when I'm reading those, I always kind of look at it as like, if I was a judge, which I'm not, but I'm looking at this, could I be questioning what was expected here? And if the answer is yes, then it'd be reasonable to assume that seller or buyer could be questioning that too. So I agree, being as specific as possible in any of your, you know, like you said, windows to be replaced. So seller to replace windows prior to closing, could that come into question on like your point that they just had windows delivered and they're like, well, we didn't say we'd install them. We just said we'd replace them. But then would a judge argue like, well, replacing includes installing? I don't know. It's probably just better to have seller to have Anderson Windows out to install and replace all windows prior to closing. I got a question in the chat. Are there ever instances where you recommend or support submitting offers contingent upon financing? Obviously, pre-approval is better, but in the instance where a client loves a home, wants to submit an offer, but hasn't got their pre-approval completed yet, I would say that you obviously could. Would I? No. I would put the pressure on the buyer to get their pre-approval completed. Typically, you can get that done within a matter of a couple of hours. If I'm representing the seller and you submit me an offer that doesn't have a pre-approval letter, I'm not going to take you seriously.
Yeah, thank you. And that's what I have advised as well. But I just, wanted to make sure that I was not giving that hard and fast answer if that's not something that,
yeah, I mean, it's not like required as part of the purchase agreement, but sellers just, especially if you're in multiple offers, they're not even, they're just going to move on. Like you don't even seem serious or have the, how do we even know you have the financial ability to purchase this? And again, because it can happen so quickly, like all the more reason for you to be able to transfer them over to Matt or Cullen in the event that it's Saturday night at 7 o'clock and they're working with Wells Fargo and you can't get a hold of it. Right?
Exactly.
I probably should have said Wells Fargo, but one of those big box lenders. What are the most things that are get called out by an FHA appraiser? Peeling paint, carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, GFCI outlets within, who remembers, I always get confused if it's 3 feet or 6 feet. 6 feet. 6 feet, but from any water source that's in not only kitchens, bathrooms, but also laundry rooms. And then a handrail. I always see this too. If it's more than 3 steps, it needs to have a handrail and it has to be at a certain height. These are the most common ones. Cracked windows. Windows need to be operable as well. Those are probably the most common things I see called out on FHA. Anybody else? Anything we missed there?
Are GFCI outlets on the exterior called out?
Oh, they should be. If they're not, they should be.
Yeah, Hannah said they're not, they should be.
I figured, but I've never had it come up. I was just curious if there was a difference between the exterior versus interior.
No, because it's still a health hazard.
Yeah.
Regardless if it's interior or
exterior. Well, and exterior, think about it, has more ability to get wet than anything. especially in
That's why
Minnesota.
I'm wondering if a cover, that's why I'm wondering if a cover would be required in that case on the
Yeah, actually, I
exterior.
feel like now that you mentioned that, I feel like I have seen the covers required. I've never actually, don't know if I've seen GFCI required on the exterior, but I have seen a cover required on the outside.
Also,
I've never seen either.
outlet plates are also.
Outlet plates, right? No exposed wires. Also another big one for FHA that will get called out is the Federal Pacific electrical panels. Because they are a fire hazard. So those will generally get called out. So like on my most recent FHA one, during our showing, I realized I'm on Federal Pacific. So in my negotiation of the purchase agreement, I had put in the other section for the seller to have a licensed electrician to replace the Federal Pacific panel prior to the FHA appraisal. And if it wasn't completed prior to the FHA appraisal, that the seller would be responsible for the reinspection.
I have a question that I literally just thought of.
Yeah.
Because I have an offer on my listing that's contingent, and now they might get an offer. I literally just got a phone call from those buyers agent, might get an offer. If that's the case, and they can't remove their contingency fast enough, and we attempt to renegotiate the price to continue working with them, but they've already had their appraisal, long story short, can we renegotiate price after an appraisal?
You can, but I would say that then the buyer's gonna have to bring the cash difference in because the lender's not gonna do
Otherwise, you have to have it reappraised, and you maybe have to switch lenders and start all over again.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would double check with the lender, but
Or reduce
You
their
know,
down payment.
and if it was FHA, which I know this one isn't because of the price point, but if it was FHA,
can't
reappraise.
Or VA.
Or VA.
Is USDA like that? Sticks with it for 6 months also. So it's the government loans.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
USDA
So what-
follows the same appraise or work order stuff too as
Yeah.
VA and FHA.
Go ahead, Chris.
So what do you do if somebody has an FHA loan and you send through an amendment requesting the safety items and they say, we're not going to fix the CO detectors, we'll give you a credit?
Well, you can't do that with an FHA loan.
Well,
That's
it
why
depends. Are you an inspection contingency
Right.
negotiation, or are you
in lender
getting a work
orders.
order from a lender?
So that goes back to, remember the lender commitment work order section of the purchase agreement, where with FHA and VA buyers, I always put at minimum $250 to $500 in there because I don't want the deal to fall apart over smoke detectors or carbon monoxide detectors.
That's interesting. I always put 0 because I always leave myself room to negotiate later, and I typically have never had a problem. At one time, people held I guess twice we've had to do something as a buyer
So
to get it done.
the reason I always put that in my FHA or VA is because I actually represented the seller once. Buyer was an FHA buyer. Things went south between buyer and seller for a whole variety of reasons. And by the time we got to the appraisal, the only thing called out was it was a sliding glass door that didn't have a deck and it had no locking mechanism on it. So we needed that for the loan to go through. And the seller was so pissed at this buyer and was looking at any reason to get out of it. And they were refusing to do it. So some of you, I did end up doing it. So some of you heard me joke, like I'm a proud owner of a radon mitigation system for a house I've never owned in St. Louis Park. And also the proud owner of a locking mechanism and a property in Ramsey.
Which locking mechanisms, it's due to appraiser. It's not necessarily required on every deal.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I would say everything is. It depends on if they call it out or
yeah,
right.
Because some appraisers miss things all the time.
I tried to negotiate correction of peeling paint on this house where the entire house was peeling, it felt like, and it was a VA loan. I tried it at the initial offer. I tried it after inspection, and the seller was like, if it comes up at VA appraisal, we'll do it then. And it didn't get called out. And I was
it exterior or interior?
Exterior.
I've never had exterior paint.
Oh, that's the
I had exterior paint called out on a detached garage.
I've never had a.
I just had a deck this last fall. Peeling paint.
Two buildings.
I think exterior peeling paint is more common to be called out than interior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had it called out.
All right.
Never.
Next question. If the sale cancels on the day of closing and you represent the seller, can you immediately relist the property if the buyer refuses to sign a cancellation?
No.
No. A contract is not canceled unless all parties sign an agreement or you have a statutory cancellation through the court system. Even if your close date it has gone by, that doesn't matter. You have to have a cancellation signed by all parties that indicate what is to be done with earnest money.
Can you change the status to a
You can
contingent
change the status to AO, active contingent upon other, and then agent remarks put
in
contingent upon signed cancellation. And that's something I actually use to my advantage when we represent buyers. A lot of you actually ran into this with me before, where like maybe buyers aren't really in the right to cancel, but they want to cancel, and I'm like, well, just refuse to sign the cancellation then, because the sellers can't do anything. They can't do anything. They can list an AO, you know, and then you might get stuck with being in limbo with earnest money. And usually sellers finally just get another offer, come to their senses, sign the cancellation. So
I don't think people understand how hard it is to actually get the earnest money. Like, to keep earnest money is rare,
right?
It's challenging for a seller to get.
So that was another question that came up last week by an agent, and they were asking like, how much weight do you put on earnest money? And I said 0, because it's like so hard for a seller to actually retain that earnest money. I know other agents will disagree with me, and other agents like to see a significant amount of money in their earnest money section, especially in multiple offers. I know when I'm presenting multiple offers to my seller, that's not something I really want to focus on. I go over it, but I say just what I said to you. Very rarely do I actually see a situation that the seller retains it.
I don't talk about it even with my buyers, I don't talk about it in terms of the seller being able to keep it. I talk about it in terms of showing strength, and that you're not waiting for something to happen to have the cash to close.
Right.
So it shows that you are cash heavy now, which can create trust. And I use it as that.
Yeah. And I think
so like,
that's
I'm not waiting for my tax return. I'm not waiting for grandma to die. That's exactly what I
And I think that that's fair. But when sellers ask me like, how much does earnest money matter? And I'm like,
Right.
well, I mean, it shows that they have some money in the bank and probably some financial stability. It doesn't, like, to me, strengthen the offer in terms of if it's going to get to closing or not anymore. And oddly enough, I've seen recently buyers walking away from a lot of earnest money. One buyer and agent on our team, she was a couple days before closing, did her final walkthrough, decided she didn't like that development anymore, and she wanted to go over here, and she walked away from 10 grand.
Right.
So,
I mean, my clients almost did over a roof issue because the cost to replace the roof was going to be significantly more than the earnest money that they had on the line for canceling. So we had them do like a roof inspection outside of the inspection contingency to see if we could get it replaced under insurance, which, by the way, if you're representing the seller, never agree to that, period, plain and simple, because we used it as a negotiating tactic and we got more money off, which was exactly what I wanted to do.
Right.
But they were going to walk away from like an $8,000 earnest money or something, because the roof is going to cost like $25,000 to replace.
I think I remember that one too. All right, next question. Should a lead-based paint brochure be included in the purchase agreement and required by buyers to initial a proof of repairs? I just posted this in Slack last week. I posted the brochure. The lead-based paint addendum specifically states that the buyer has received that book. So if you have a lead-based paint addendum in play, absolutely every one of your buyers should have been provided with this brochure. And it's the agent's responsibility. I could probably ask you all to raise your hands on if you've provided the lead-based paint brochure to every one of your clients who's had lead-based paint, and I don't think I'd probably get a single hand.
I don't think I've
Don't ask me over email because I will not respond.
Oh, I missed that email. Went to my junk folder. I'm sorry.
So I posted that brochure in Slack last week. It's also an Instanet. Keep it on your desktop. Anytime you have a property built prior to 1978, just email it off to your client.
Put it in your high note.
Or put it in your high note. Whatever you want to do. The lead-based paint, the lead-based paint addendum that is signed by all parties states that the buyer has received a copy of that, and it's your responsibility as the agent to get it to them.
Well, there's buyer ones too.
Okay, let's see. We have 10 minutes left. I have a few more lists of questions, but before I just kind of finish going through these, do you guys have any questions that you want to ask that I can just leave this open for a few minutes?
Can you send me an article about those murders?
Can I send you the article? Sure, I can.
Cass, this is Alexa. Will you also send me, I don't know how long you guys have been on these questions, but will you send me those recordings from the last ones that you guys have done as well?
Pretty much. I know that the marketing team is working on getting caught up, but everything will be on our YouTube channel.
Awesome. Okay. Sounds great. Thanks, Mark.
Give me like until the end of the week and it'll be all caught up.
Yeah, Hannah said it takes you
Sounds
guys,
great.
it takes a really long
Take
time
hours.
because she's got to download them all and then upload them all, and sounds terrible.
It's like 2 hours per video up. It's
Oh,
wild.
gosh.
Yeah.
I
You have to
appreciate it
listen.
so much though. Even if it's longer out, at least it gets done at some point. It's amazing, you guys. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Okay, another thing that I personally want to touch on is home sale contingencies. This came up with Crystal today. It's come up with, Jonathan has one that's going on. One thing I want you guys to know is if a home is, if you're accepting an offer contingent on a home sale contingency, the only way to remove that home sale contingency per the addendum is by providing a purchase agreement that has no other contingencies except financing. So if you want to call the contingency and the buyer's like, okay, we're going to get a bridge loan, you can say, no, that doesn't satisfy that contingency. Would you want to argue that if you didn't have another offer? Probably not. But if you have another offer that's better, you can't just remove that home sale contingency by now saying you're going to get a bridge loan or any other kind of gap loan. So what I personally do in my offers when I'm representing a buyer that's contingent on a home sale, on the other section of the home sale contingency addendum, I write, buyer retains the right to obtain alternative financing in an effort to remove this home sale contingency. That way, if my buyer can at last minute get a bridge loan or something else, I had that contingency in there as an acceptable means to remove that home sale contingency.
Kassie.
Yeah.
That can be amended off the purchase agreement. It would be atypical, but that can be amended out outside of that scenario, correct?
I'm sorry, Jeff, what was that?
Like outside of the, like if they haven't called the contingency to be up yet, but you're trying to, maybe they're wanting to urge things along, maybe things are taking a while. That can be just if everyone agrees, correct?
You completely cut out, Jeff. I think what you're saying is basically, you know, let's say the contingency is not being called and the seller doesn't have another offer. Could you use the bridge loan? Absolutely, if the seller agrees. If the seller's like, yeah, that's fine. If you want to remove it by this means, everyone could agree. I draft an amendment, you know, that states, hey, buyer and seller agree that buyers hereby removing home sale contingency through obtaining a bridge loan or whatever it is, and get that in writing. So you're right, buyer and even if seller had another offer and you didn't include that in the purchase agreement, seller could still agree to that by a means of it. But if you really, as a listing agent and the seller, have a better offer and the buyer's trying to come in and say, oh, we're going to remove it through this bridge loan, you can say, nope, you can't. The addendum states that you have to provide me a purchase agreement that's not contingent on anything other than financing, which includes, Crystal and I were talking about this morning, her own personal situation where there was a 10-day CIC period. So there was no inspection and it was financing and CIC, and the listing agent kind of strong-armed them because of that CIC contingency.
Which is a gray area based on all of the conversations I had with the legal department, but because it wasn't a guaranteed win if we had to go to court, it wasn't worth fighting over it. We just kind of settled in the middle on something.
One of the other questions is a buyer required to sign a rep agreement prior to the agent making an offer on their behalf, or is it okay to do this up until the point of closing? The answer to this is absolutely, you should have a buyer rep in place before you're making an offer. Technically, you should have a buyer rep. If you're providing any kind of representation to them, I've actually seen, if anyone's interested, I have a whole entire website of all of the complaints that get made against agents at the Department of Commerce, what the complaint was and what the resolution was. I'm kind of nerdy and I read through these frequently because I learn from them. I know that's not everybody's cup of tea. If you're interested, I have that. But actually, agents have been fined for this in an argument that they were providing representation to the buyer without a representation agreement. So the answer to that is you should get that buyer rep agreement signed, I mean, as soon as you can, but
I have a question.
especially if you're at the time of writing an offer. Yeah, go ahead, Alexa.
Okay, so say that you explain to them, hey, just want to let you guys know that because I am providing a little bit of this, and that to you, it's really essential that we have this buyer representation agreement signed, blah, blah, blah. What if they're like, well, we don't care. We don't care. We don't want to sign it anyways.
Well, I would let them know that you can't legally submit an offer on their behalf without it. If they're refusing to sign it at a time where you feel like it should be signed because they're starting to ask questions, then you really have to have the knowledge and the experience to tell them on a question that they answered, I'm sorry, I don't represent you and I can't be answering those questions. That goes back to this buyer rep agreement that we discussed a couple of weeks ago that you weren't interested in signing. By signing that, it gives me the ability to represent you.
So if they start asking questions like that are like with buyer rep and stuff, you literally need to say, I am not able to answer these questions legally because we do not have you under buyer representation.
I mean, the cut and dry answer to that is accurate. Do we all practice it, you know, probably more than we should, where we're giving buyers representation? I don't know that I feel like that happens as frequently, you know what I mean? Like, the time I'm presenting my buyer reps, I usually have a strong enough relationship with them that I don't get a lot of pushback on getting them signed.
Right. I was going to say, I think getting it signed when you're writing an offer is all about your delivery. When I'm prepping to write an offer, we focus heavily on the offer. And then I say, oh, by the way, the first few pages are going to be paperwork officially hiring me. I need this in order to submit this on your behalf. The biggest question I get is this, and I always talk about how the commission part is written, because otherwise they ask me every time. It's confusing anyways. It
says buyer shall pay.
Yeah.
But then they never actually get down to the
right.
Yeah, because they just read that and they panic, and then you're like, okay, go to this subsection.
Which I think if you're not telling them in advance about that, then they're going to be scared to sign anything with you. So I think telling them that when I'm talking about the buyer rep form, and then telling them about where it says, you know, down below that it isn't their responsibility, and using my experience, you know, 7 years, no one's ever had to pay me, blah, blah, blah. Then I feel like there's no questions. I've never gotten pushback ever in 7 years on a buyer representation. If it's when I'm writing their first offer. Anything prior to that, you have way more risk of getting pushback. And honestly, like, I don't even ask for it anymore because there's more risk to losing the client in my mind than there is benefit in having a buyer rep form.
And we kind of talked, Alexa, like within the first couple meetings of a buyer, if it's like a Zillow buyer or someone I don't know, I will provide them the blank documents and say, eventually we're going to need these signed. And that's whether you work with me or anybody else. This is a state requirement. That way they can read through them, come up with their questions. And at the time that you actually need to go get the signatures on them, they're more comfortable with it. A lot of agents view the buyer rep documents as just a way for us to get paid, which I don't feel like they are worth the paper they're written on in terms of actually getting paid.
Right.
You know, I don't want to go, our time's almost up. I don't want to go too deep into that. But really it is, in the Department of Commerce eyes, is providing them representation, and you should have it signed if you're providing any kind of guidance or representation to them during transaction.
I have one last question. Really quick. When it says buyer shall pay and it says that 2.7%, just say for the instance, I'm just preparing for, you know, down the line, that seller decides for whatever reason, they're not going to pay a commission, and it says 0% to everybody. And it says on that buyer rep, you know, buyer shall pay 2.7%. Then if the listing agent isn't providing any commission, then would it actually be legally bound to that buyer?
Correct. And that's the purpose of it. Same with if you put 2.7 in your buyer rep and the MLS or the seller's only providing 2.2 or 2.5, your buyer's technically responsible for the difference. I've never gone after my buyers for that because I mean it ends up being
well, and if you're doing a compensation disclosure, doesn't that override?
Yeah, you have to do a compensation.
You have to do the compensation.
So that's what I also talk about when I send it.
Also, just another fun fact is part of being part of our MLS is required to provide some kind of compensation to the buyer's side. So unless it's visible, you'll never see zero. That doesn't mean that they can not just put $1 in there, but to be part of the MLS and cooperating with other brokers, there has to be some form of compensation.
Okay. All
right, guys. We are going to end this good chat. I hope some people got some good things out of it. We're going to end this, and Liz will go right into our team meeting. So a lot of you, I'm just going to end recording and you can just stay on.
I gotta jump on over here though.
Oh, never
It
mind.
might kick it.
We're probably gonna kick some of you off. Well, if you sign in, either way.
We'll see you soon.
Yeah, we'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.